Hello and welcome to Conf42Cast. My name is Miko Pawlikowski, and today my absolute pleasure is to host Ben Ofiri, the co-founder and CEO at Komodor. Ben, how are you doing?
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for finding times. It wasn't easy with the different time zones. I'm glad it worked out. So first, let's confuse you a little bit. If you could live anywhere in our solar system, where would it be?
An interesting question to start with. I think that after with all of the COVID-19 situation, definitely I want some place away from people. Not sure. So probably Earth is not a good option. Probably Mars not as well, with all of the Bezos and Elon Musks of the world trying together. So we'll probably be maybe on Saturn's ring, drinking some cocktail and watching people trying to get to different planets from Earth.
Love it. I appreciate the honesty. All right. So for everybody on Spotify who can't see Ben, he looks very professional. There is a Komodor background and it's hard to miss Komodor. So I'm going to go and jump straight to that. Ben, you started the company. Why?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually co-founded Komodor a year and a half ago together with my partner, which is today our CTO. And both of us were developers, so we came from a very technical background. We're backend developers, infrastructure engineers. I think the kind of developers that today will be defined as DevOps or even SRE in some companies. And we had several years of experience working for different companies. I worked for Google for almost 6 years, and my partner started in a big company like eBay. Then he transitioned to work for smaller companies and smaller startups. And actually, the pain that we felt personally on our own flesh and blood from our years as developers and DevOps developers, and from the weeks or months that we spent in on-call rotations, those were basically the basis or the motivation for us to start the company. So actually, we were very frustrated for many years from how hard it was and how tedious it was to troubleshoot complex and distributed systems. Today, obviously, contained from Kubernetes, but a couple of years ago, it might be some Lambda and VMwares and serverless and EC2, etc. What we both of us felt for many years is that given an alert, given an issue, given an incident, which is just a matter of time when the company is big enough, right? It's a matter of seconds, minutes, hours, days. The first thing usually you do is you ask yourself, wait, what the heck happened in the system? 5 minutes ago, everything was great. Now I'm getting this alert or getting this a symptom from one of the monitoring systems and trying to understand what changed. I'm trying to gather all the context needed. But this job, this very naive description that just try to understand what happened is sometimes a very hard task and a very, very hard problem for a lot of R&D organizations from the single fact that no one really knows what changed in the system. So the systems are usually very distributed and very complex, and they change very rapidly. And basically, you need to be an expert in all of those different tools, right? Like Kubernetes, Jenkins, GitHub, maybe your monitoring systems, maybe Vault, Console, other configuration systems, maybe in the cloud layer in AWS or GKE, etc. And probably you are not an expert in all of those tools because you're developers that like to write code. So it's a very hard task. It requires a lot of expertise and can be very frustrating for a lot of people. And at some point, we decided that, hey, let's try to think together if we can ease this experience, if we can change our people troubleshooting, and if we can take this very complex and frustrating process to make it something that is very easy and sometimes even trivial to do. And with this ambition or with this goal, we actually started to work on what is today Komodor.
Okay. So would you say that the kind of starting point and the unique selling point from the beginning was tracking all the differences of what goes into, production in the end and all the other stages, and then kind of grew from there?
Yeah, so differences is a tricky definition because sometimes you have a difference because someone made a code change or a configuration change, right, from X to Y or something like that. But sometimes the difference is a difference in the health of a system, right? Maybe it was healthy and now it's not healthy, or maybe it's somewhere in between. So it's very tricky to exactly define what are the most interesting factors or what are the things you need to look for when you have an issue. But it's definitely somewhere between the changes themselves, the statuses of the different components, and maybe most importantly, the relations between the different subcomponents, their statuses, and what changed there. So you basically need to have the understanding of not only what changed, but also how those changes correlate or relate to each other, and how together they can affect a status change or a health change or a different symptom in your system.
Right. So to take the example of Kubernetes, which I think is probably going to be the most popular option for everybody listening to this, or most of them. So it's basically like diffing the YAMLs plus looking at the events of what actually happened and when things stopped working and getting all of that together somehow to mash it up into a congruent image.
Yeah. So if we think, for example, 1 second about Kubernetes. So my analogy for Kubernetes for dummies, right, not for technical people, is that it's very similar to an analog watch. So, in most of the time it just works and it's like a magic, right? Like you can tell the hour, great, it's 6 p.m. You don't need to think about how behind the scene the thing works, right? You don't care. But when your watch stops working and if you have an analog watch, you hope that it's the battery, right? Maybe you can replace the battery, is great. But if not, you're screwed, right? You probably need to go to some expert or some technicians because you will never be able to grasp the complexity behind all of the different subcomponents there. So Kubernetes is pretty similar, much more complex, much more distributed, much harder to grasp, but the analogy is very similar. So in most of the time it just works, but when it doesn't, it's not only a matter of doing some diff between some files, because there can be hundreds of thousands of files that all of them changed in the last hour. So what are the things that you're trying to match? What are the things you're trying to find? What are the questions you're trying to ask yourself? So maybe you'll find the answers by diffing some files. Those are, in my experience and my opinion, those are the complex issues. This is the real problem there, like getting the context of how those different components work together. Like, for example, an obvious example is that you have a pod that is doing restarts, right? It's in a crash loop backup mode. This pod is doing restarts. You get an alert. You have a pod that is not loading. Okay, you can check, the pod YAML file. You will see nothing maybe. What's next? And maybe then you need to understand, wait, is this the only pod that is doing restarts? Or maybe then all of the pods that are on the same node are doing restarts. So it might be something in the node. Okay, it's all of the pods. Okay, so it's a problem in the node. Let's go check the node. And then you see, okay, what's the problem in the node? The node look healthy, but you might be able to understand that, it has a provision issue. So you might need to increase the CPU or the memory. So basically you need to know which questions you want to ask before you actually go to doing any diffs or to checking any information. And from our experience, usually the developers, the on-call developers, etc., just don't even know which questions they need to ask. And then they don't have the tools to really answer those. And this is, I would say, the biggest problem we're trying to tackle, or the biggest pain we're trying to solve.
Right. And that reminds me, first time I was playing with Kubernetes auditing logs, the first thing I noticed is that it's not actually that easy to get any meaningful information out of that if you just log things about pods. Just to separate the automated stuff that just keeps happening in the background and supposed to be happening in the background from the actual changes that you make, it was already pretty tricky to get to that stage. So I can see definitely why
I think we spent 5 years of, one engineers only to separate automatic stuff like HPA and autoscaling, adapting, etc., from manual stuff. We call it expected and unexpected. We thought it's like 1 week project, hey, let's take the expected, we're increasing the number of replicas, right? Because there is an auto-scaling. So obviously it's okay that we have only 50 replicas and not 60 because we're in the middle of increasing it, right? It's natural. This is how Kubernetes works. Versus we need to have 60 replicas for some bad reason. We have only 50 replicas available. This is a bug. It's affecting production, like you're bleeding money. And we thought, hey, it's a nice project to differentiate between those two scenarios. And it ended up with one of the biggest obstacles and challenges we had in the company, which I'm proud to say that we overcome, but it was not that easy to do.
Speaking of overcoming challenges, I'm wondering, for this kind of project, getting it off the ground, and you started during COVID, so I'm going to come back to that in a minute because I'm very curious how that actually affected you. But what would you say were the biggest challenges to overcome to get it off the ground?
So obviously our solution, it's pretty sensitive, right? Because we need to install some agent within the Kubernetes of our customers, right? In the VPC of our customers, whether it's an on-prem or it's managed in one of the cloud providers. And, when we started, it was only a year and 2 months ago, we didn't have any LinkedIn page. We didn't have any website. We're completely in stealth mode. And even if we were having a website, it didn't contain anything interesting. And basically, we knocked on the doors of the head of DevOps of, great companies in Israel, in Europe, in the USA. And basically we offer them to install some agent that can read all of their changes, right? The metadata changes and the code changes, and it digests everything and provides insight. And we thought that they would say, yeah, sure, go ahead. But it was not that of
Pinky promise, one still the data.
yeah. So, obviously, as some of the listeners can hear, we have some accent. We're Israelis. So there's like cultural issues. There are time differences. There is language barriers. So it was not that easy to convince, head of DevOps or director of SRE in, some of the biggest and most successful companies in Europe and the USA to actually allow us to install our solution in their production system without any, security certification back then and without any evidence that it actually works. So we worked pretty hard on that. Basically, we had sandbox environment, and we did the POC with our first design partners and customers. We are working very with the definition of Kubernetes, with all of the RABAC configurations, etc. So our users can actually see via the Kubernetes manifest which resources we consume and how. So we tried to really work, together with our customers in order to get this first trust. But I think now, after successful onboarding of dozens of customers, we're finally there. Like we're finally getting customers from references and customers that heard about us from different companies. And this barrier is obviously much lower today as a bit more mature company than it was when we just started.
Yeah, and you only started early last year, right? I guess out of the stealth mode, really. So let's talk about COVID and pandemic. How was it to build the whole thing basically during one of the weirdest times in living memory?
I will give the disclaimer that I don't have anything to compare to. So it's the first time I founded a company. It's the first time I founded a company. And it happens to be in the weirdest time ever, but I really can't compare it, to 5 years ago or anything like that. So I can tell you how it was for us. Both of us had this, great goal and motivation that I mentioned earlier to change how people are troubleshooting and to change how developers are operating Kubernetes. And it was so excited for us that we decided to leave our very convenient day jobs. So I was a product manager in Google Duplex, which was back then one of the coolest project I think Google did for a couple of years. And my partner was a first employee in another startup that is doing dev tools named Drukart when, he was very happy in his job. And, we decided to quit our day jobs to fulfill our dream. But this was in February last year. And it was before the pandemic was, a global pandemic. It was something that you read on the news, in the end of the news about something that, is happening in China. And after a few weeks, when we started to do the ideation and validation, and we actually, decided that we want to raise money and to really start the company, it was somewhere, I think, between March and April. It was the exact time where Donald Trump decided that, he's locking down America. The national sport stopped, like, the NBA and the NFL. And I told my partner, look, if in the USA they don't play sport anymore, we're doomed. It's not going to work. And to help us, Sequoia just released an open letter that called 2020 the Black Swan of investment. And basically, they recommended all of the VCs not to invest in new companies, but rather save the funds to their existing portfolio. So obviously, it was very nerve-wracking experience. Both of us left our day jobs. We have families to support. We need to do something, right? And we said to ourselves that we have a lot of motivation. We have a strong team. We're going to do it anyway. And we went and we raised the seed round, which was back then not that easy to do. Today companies are raising money in a very high rate. But, a year and a half ago, there was like a few months of almost a complete halt. But we raised the seed round from great VCs and angel investors. We hired the first employees and we just went full blown to start working on the first MVP. And fortunately for us, things worked out both for us and I think for the entire investment economic. And, we also raised the A round shortly 6 or 7 months after it. So things worked out fine eventually.
They surely do seem so. So do you want to talk about the latest funding round?
Sure. I can share the things that I can.
Still some news.
Yeah. So the seed round was, as I mentioned, like something like a year and 2 months ago. And originally the money should be sufficient for us for at least 2 years when we raised the seed round. But shortly after, we started working on the MVP when having first design partners and first customers, it seemed, at least from my perspective, that, something changed on how VCs and maybe how, other people grasp what Kubernetes is and what it's doing to the world. So when we raised the seed round, not a lot of the VCs really understand the cultural changes, the real effect, the prominent effect that Kubernetes brings to organizations. But something happened there in those 6, 7, 8 months after we raised the seed round. And all of a sudden, doing something with Kubernetes that is helping developer and DevOps became trivial, right? Like, yeah, obviously you need to do troubleshooting for Kubernetes. Obviously you need to secure Kubernetes better. Obviously you need to rep Kubernetes and allow to ship Kubernetes faster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically what happened is that once we got the early traction for first customers, we had all of the, I would call them top tier VCs in Europe and in the USA knocking on our doors, and those are the same VCs that probably would not answer our phone calls like just 6 months ago, right? Asking, hey, how come we never met? How come we're not talking about the A round? And I was like, wait a bit, we're still trying to get the first traction, we're still building the product, but there was a very large appetite from the VCs, and eventually basically we got preempted by several VCs, and we were fortunate enough to be able to choose the partner that we want to work with, and we chose Excel, which are amazing partner to work with. I don't need to say good things about Excel. Obviously, their brand is amazing, and it was a love in the first sight, and I'm very, very happy that we teamed up with them. And they're helping us since then. So we're working almost 6 months together already, and I'm really happy that we found each other.
Well, how the tides turn, right?
Yeah,
in just a few short months.
That's crazy.
One of the unique kind of points of view, unique experiences that you had was that you've kind of been on the both sides in terms of Kubernetes. You've seen Borg, you worked there, and you basically watched Kubernetes become what it was becoming, from the fence of Google. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, how it differs from Borg, as much as you can talk about that, and your personal opinion on whether Kubernetes is here to stay and why is everybody throwing money at it.
Yeah, definitely. So I will share a bit about my experience at Google. So obviously, as you probably know, you and the audience, Kubernetes started as an internal project within Google named Borg. To basically become, I would say, like the cloud operation or the engine for all of the internal Google Cloud infrastructure. And there are a few differences between Borg and Kubernetes. Kubernetes basically provides another layer of abstraction that we had in Borg in order to support different cloud providers and different environments and different components that in Google we have only one of each, right? So as probably you heard about, Google developed all of their monitoring and infrastructure and tooling internally. So we have one logging solution, we have one monitoring solution, and we have one orchestration solution, we call it for Borg. So obviously when they released Kubernetes as an open source, a lot of changes needed to happen to be much more flexible and to add more abstraction so it can work better with different components, different cloud provider, on-prem, hybrid, etc. The basis is very similar. I would say that the biggest building blocks are almost identical. And obviously the processes needed and the expertise needed to operate Borg in Kubernetes is almost overlapping. But again, besides the another layers of abstraction added to the external version.
So going to the second part of my question. So that's all cool. That's all great. But what happened? Why did it explode like this when it became Kubernetes? And why is, everybody and their pet dog investing in it now?
Yeah. So obviously, it's a great question, and you can only answer in retrospect, right? Because no one knew 2 years ago that this is going to be the situation, right? So I think there are a few reasons. One of them is I think it's obvious today that, first of all, containers are the go-to way of building modern apps, right? I don't think anyone will say now containers sucks. You should not use containers. So, it's a big chunk of why I think Kubernetes became so trivial, because Kubernetes is container is already the go-to way of building modern apps, right? Then Kubernetes ecosystem was rapidly not only maturing, but also adopted, right? So first of all, companies like Google and Netflix, announced that this is how they work. And obviously those are the companies that you look after when you try to understand what's the newest, what's the hottest, what's the thing you need to adopt. And later on, because it was open source project, a lot of companies started to adapt it. And it was like a snowball that fed itself, that eventually it became the most common open source project for the cloud native community, right? So it's also something that, helped it to grow exponentially. Then I think, the security folks, right, jumped on this train and started to secure Kubernetes. So now, there are tons of companies doing a great job on securing Kubernetes. So it's definitely enterprise ready in terms of security and compliance for organizations to use. And I think that with the digital transformation, it's very obvious that if you won't move fast, you will die. And one of the ways to move fast is to, have more microservices and have more developers, the ownership end-to-end to their production, right? This whole DevOps methodology is based on the fact that the developers and your ops guy can work together, can move fast together, and can operate as one team. And I think Kubernetes allows companies to do exactly that. Now, it also has downsides, right? It's not perfect, but it definitely allows companies to move much, much faster and to adapt to this digital transformation. So I think all of them combined led to the fact that Kubernetes, became de facto the standard for what I say is the operating system for cloud operations today.
Right. And do you think that means that with all this investment, even when, the next best thing ever comes along, we're still going to be using Kubernetes, a decade from now?
So I'm not sure if it's going to be the same Kubernetes that we know today, but I definitely think that if not, it's going to be something that is built on top of Kubernetes. For example, you probably heard about a Knative or other solutions that are providing other layers of abstractions and other capabilities upon Kubernetes. So I don't want to give my forecast if it's going to be Kubernetes 5.6 or if it's going to be something that is built on top Kubernetes, but I definitely think that it's here to last, and definitely think it's going to serve us many years to come.
So going back to Komodor, how does one get started? Where do they go? What do they do to get a taste of what Komodor is like?
So fortunately for us, we have a free trial for everyone. So basically the only thing they need to do is, first of all, they need to think that they have an issue or they have a problem, right? That they want to understand better what's happening, that they have a lot of issues in Kubernetes, that they want to understand why they have specific issues or even that they have specific issues in their system. Then the only thing they need to do is go to komodor.com, apply for the free trial. And from there, one of our solution engineers will basically reach out and start a free trial. It takes 30 minutes to deploy our solution on our customer's environment. We are very, very, very low touch. We're going to release a self-serve version very soon. But until then, we're setting up a meeting. We're opening an account and basically installing our agent on your environment. It takes roughly a few minutes, and then you can see all of Komodor's value on your system. You can play with it, you can examine it, you can ask to add more things. We really like to work very closely with our customers to receive feedback, to receive feature requests, to receive bugs complaints as well. And that's it. So super straightforward process.
All right. And the bonus question then, why is it called Komodor?
Yeah. Okay, this is the hard one. Okay, so as you probably know, all of the Kubernetes theme is around ships, water, sea, right? Kubernetes, Helm, etc. And we were looking for a name that will represent some leader in this space, right? Like my dream was to have some name that will basically reflect that we help developers and DevOps to handle the storm of complexity when you're using Kubernetes, right? It's like a ship in a very high water, and we want to be the captain of this ship. Unfortunately, captain was already occupied, no matter how you spell it, with a C, with a K, with a Q. And the second best thing we found was Komodor, which is another Navy rank, almost like a captain, and we obviously spell it with a K for Komodor, and this was the first reason why we chose Komodor. Now later on, some other employees or some other investors thought differently about the origin of the name, so we have few explanations, but if you ask me, this is the real explanation behind the name.
Right. Thank you so much. This has really been good. But before I let you go, I want to speculate a little bit with you and squeeze a little nugget of information for everybody listening. So if you were to go into speculation and make a bet on what technology or language, methodology, whatever a skill is going to become more and more important, let's say within the next 6 to 12 months, and it's worth investing time in, what would be your personal choice?
So maybe I'll surprise a bit with my answer. I don't think it's a matter of a specific programming language. For example, we stopped have a minimum requirement or criteria for a specific programming language, meaning we don't care. If you know Java, C++, Python, Node.js, React, we don't care. What we're really looking for in modern developers is the ability to become a real full stack developers. And when I'm saying a full stack, I'm not only saying, front end versus back end or something like that, but I want to have people that really understand their system, that can really understand from the deployment, when it goes to production, when you need to troubleshoot it, when you need to debug it. I want someone that can take it end to end. This is the only way I think organizations can really fulfill the DevOps movement or the DevOps idea, right? I really don't believe that what you need to have is a bunch of application developers and bunch of infrastructure developers and bunch of IT or SRE and, someone to manage all of them. I think this is the recipe for organization that won't be able to move fast enough. So what we are looking for when we interview and when we hire developers is the ability to really understand end-to-end the entire life cycle of software development, from designing to writing code, to test it, to ship it to production, and to debug it and troubleshoot it when there are issues, because there will always be issues when you want to move that fast.
Absolutely. With the disclaimer, past performance is no indication of future returns. All right. Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. Ben Ofiri, everybody, the co-founder and CEO at Komodor. What's the best way to find you?
So you can find us at Komodor.com, or just email me personally if you want at ben@Komodor.com.
There you go, a direct email to the CEO. Thank you so much for that. All the best with Komodor, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. It was really, really fun. I appreciate it.
Likewise. Thanks.